My name's Peter Sherlock. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Divinity, and I'm making a wee cameo appearance tonight to introduce Jo and Penny before I should call you Dr. Inkpin speaks to us, because Dr. Inkpin is fully accredited to run the subject Queer Theology over the coming few weeks at the University of Divinity, and we are proud and honoured to have you in our midst. Thank you. I speak to you. I was recently described in a newspaper as, what was I described as? A gay married Anglican. And I thought, is that gay married or married, comma, gay Anglican? And I'm not sure. And I said to my husband, it doesn't really matter. Recently, I attended the Anglican General Synod about a month ago, and one of the most significant things written about the Synod was a very short piece that Jo wrote about the apology that was made to queer people by the Synod, which was the one moment when I had to leave the room because I refused to take part in it. And several people said to me at the time, what is it that enables you to sit in a room of your sisters and brothers in Christ for 4 to 5 days and put up with this stuff? And I thought about it very, very carefully. For me personally, well, I take my shoes off when things get really stressful. So if you ever see me in bare feet, be very afraid. The second thing was hang out with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because they have a very strong theology of the apocalypse. It's still happening all around them, and you learn a lot about resilience and what it is to live with difference and hostility. But the dynamic that I've been exploring recently for myself is I'm very interested in dialogue. What does it take to change people's hearts and minds? What does it take to explore theological truths together with an open heart and the view that we might end up somewhere else? And I can say fairly confidently, there wasn't a lot of that on display at the Anglican Synod. There was some, but there needs to be more. But that's a real question. But that's a dialogical question which requires people to be resilient, to have the sort of strength that Jo and Penny have shown over the last 30 and 40 years in ministry. It requires a huge degree of resilience that not everybody has. And so where I've come back to thinking about tonight is that the significance of offering a properly accredited academic subject on queer theology, the chance to critically engage with that domain, is of immense significance. Why? Because it's going to push the boundaries right over here. It's going to enable people to test and question ideas well away from the pressure of that interior church dialogue, which is absolutely necessary, but is a very different exercise. And so in welcoming Jo and Penny tonight, in introducing Dr. Inkpin to speak to us, I want to very much affirm the importance of what it is specifically that you bring to us tonight. Not only that resilience, that commitment to testimony and witness to being disciples of Christ and being faithful in that in all that you do and have done, but in particular in helping us push the boundaries, think into where the Spirit of God might be leading us. So it's my pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that very warm welcome, and to all of you for your welcome to us tonight. We want, in beginning, as has already been beautifully done, to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the sovereign and unceded country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, who have cared for this country since its creation. May we have courage to work for a more just settlement between Indigenous peoples and later comers.
Oh, that's it. We'll go back. How do we go back?
I scroll to go back.
Oh, well, might need, no.
I think. Well, it did work before, Adria. We pressed something.
One too many, I think. Other way. That's it. That's it. Good. Excellent. I'll do it and not make a mess. Let me share a personal story. After coming out publicly as a transgender woman, I'd gone back to England, mostly to see my ailing parents, but also to visit some old haunts, not least my beloved childhood football club. Because in addition to an abiding love of history, 3 F words had kept me alive growing up: faith, feminism, and football, the beautiful game. Stepping through the old gates was therefore a coming home on several levels, but also moving forward. I was a little bit nervous how I might be received. I stopped for a second to view the stadium, so well known to me, but seen afresh. Hey up, duck, do you know where you're going? Oh yes, I said, blown away by the greeting from the rough and ready steward. Thank you so much. It was a very powerful moment, for the steward probably did not know what he had done. He had called me duck. It's a typically friendly local address for a female you don't know personally, not a male or someone who looks that they don't fit. So I felt fully recognized in what in some ways remains my second home. I'd been fully accepted just as I was. Did I know where I was going? I sure did. I was returning to the old railway end of my formative years, but this time not with the accompanying fears of sexist, homophobic and transphobic violence, made audible even in the periodic chants of so-called supporters and in very real, occasionally violent skirmishes. Now we, my club and I, and they've done a lot of work, are a community together, a place where we might greet one another with our true identities and build a future. And that's part of a wider welcome journey, because if you do that stuff, other things happen. And my little football club has risen from near extinction to some of its best years, a rise, reconnecting all kinds of people in revivified community. Now, certainly football has a long way to go in queer and feminist acceptance, even if the more lovable levels of my little club show the way forward. Now, it's a little bit different in the women's game. But the recent coming out of gay male players and referees in Australia and England has made news. For homophobia like sexism and racism is still very much alive in the world of sport. And we hardly need to mention sporting transphobia right now, do we? This year's Mega Money World Cup will take place in one of the world's least queer-friendly nations. But uneven though progress is, there is some hope. German football is at least being typically professional about transgender participation, even if Anglo sport may be recoiling into misplaced prejudice. What, though, of faith spaces for queer people? Do we know where we're going?
So as been suggested, we are marking a little historic landmark this week, aren't we, with the Queer Theology course here at Pilgrim within the University of Divinity, probably the first such university level course in Australia. So whoopee, yeah. Hey. And so we would like, therefore, to thank publicly all those involved in helping this to happen, not least queer elders who have paved the way, because these things don't happen, do they, without struggle. Each step of liberation also needs not just celebrating, but probably means more than we quite recognize at this moment. Every little new light enables other lights and pushes the darkness away. And so it's a good moment. We're here tonight just to breathe it in for a moment and to take stock of where we as fellow ducks, if you don't mind being called a fowl, might ask ourselves, where are we, fellow ducks? Where are we going? It would be good to feel that we might move on, might we, from some of the worst of spiritual violence towards queer people on and off the field in Australia. One of the most powerful images of the last federal election was that of the then Prime Minister bulldozing a small child in a game of association football. It epitomized, didn't it, the misuse of power, lack of fairness, and clumsy cruelty of the former government's handling of issues of religious freedom and LGBTIQ rights in schools and workplaces, aided and abetted by disproportionate noise and activity from the Christian right, and really the overly quiet murmurings of concern at best from most other Christian spaces, I'm sure present company excepted. No wonder trans females feel so victimized at present. Why are such tiny and already quite traumatized numbers being picked on, when such little attention is being paid to vast inequities of inherited power and privilege that enable such foul play? And as in sport, fairness in faith is blatantly disregarded. Truly, we do seem to be straining at hypothetical gnats while swallowing manifestly monstrous camels. And this is the reality of much Australian Christianity, where some leaders also throw their weight dangerously upon the most vulnerable. So our hope is that this forthcoming Queer Theology course is a harbinger of many more substantial things. You know, this is going to be the most introductory broad sweep you've ever seen. So there's plenty of room to dig in and do more research. The harbinger of more things to come, both in terms of theological and other outworkings. So as the contribution to that process, we offer up 5 things for consideration tonight. We've made it easy for you. There's a mnemonic: flair. But not how you thought we might have done.
Firstly, flourish. What are we really seeking? To put it another way, can we stop talking about inclusion and help queer people actually flourish? Part of me would frankly like a Christian moratorium on the word inclusive. I'm not far off feeling the same about affirming too. Both words are much better than welcoming, but sometimes they're just as frustrating in addressing what we might call the Russian roulette of church life that queer people experience, even when they walk into so-called inclusive churches, especially for trans people, because some people think they know about gay people, but trans people are different, so are intersex, so are non-binary, and so on. When my friend the steward called me duck, he was extending recognition and respect to me, not including me. For it was, is, and will always be my club, just as much as it belongs to him or anyone. It's like that once popular song, you know, for everyone a place at the table. Well, I don't want a place at the table, at least as it is. It's my table, after all. Insofar as being Christ's table, it's anyone's. It's not for someone else to give it to me. As a trans person, I want a different kind of table, a different range of food, and a different range of conversation. Indeed, I don't even want gender neutral language as such, although sometimes it's useful. I want gender expansive. And really, I don't even want a safe place. And sometimes we've been so consumed because of abuse about safety, but actually, you see, if you build a space to flourish, it has to be a safe space, but it's more than a safe space. So I want a queer feast, not just the same old fare. We need much more than inclusion. We need this flourishing. And I think we need to shift inclusion, if we're going to use it, from passive to active, from permission to belong, which often is what it is, to genuine empowerment. Or as I sometimes like to put it, from adjective to noun to verb. Deeds, not just words, as the old suffragette historian in me cries out. Marcella Althaus-Reid expressed it well. Inclusion aims to absorb the abnormal into the normal, if it will agree to assimilate. But then rather than actually change in the face of diversity, it tries to include and absorb.
There are, of course, parallels with First Nations experiences of reconciliation, and why that word too has become difficult for some. Terminology allowing mere accommodation by the privileged is problematic. That is one reason Marcella Althaus-Reid challenged theologians to embrace indecent theology. For as she put it, it is indecent to begin theology from the marginalized. It is indecent to unmask the ideologies that exist in our theologies. If queer people of faith are included in a good way, this only occurs when we and our concerns are truly visible, however indecent that might seem to others. For the real theological issues here are not queer sexuality and gender expression. The elephant in the room, as Elizabeth Stewart identified long ago, more than 40 years ago, the real elephant in the room is heterosis normativity. And we might add, especially in its colonial forms. Vanilla heterosexuality and binary gender don't actually exist. Without addressing this, we will continue to lack meaningful sexual ethics and perpetuate violence. Or as Grace Jansen wrote more than 20 years ago, a feminist natal, not mortal, natal ethic of flourishing is essential for all, redeeming the death-bearing cultic tendencies of modern faith.
Secondly, L for lead. Who's taking up the work? There are two parts to this. On the one hand, whilst thankful for many allies and many who are here in this room, particularly, queer faith leaders often find ourselves alone because faced by the Christian right's money and media power, and if you live in Sydney, you know that's the heart of it. We have sometimes had to strain hard to hear some of the whispers of others. So like First Nations people who wonder where people like me, sometimes the supposed white fella allies are, we know Martin Luther King's words well. In the end, we'll remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. On the other hand, more importantly, most Christian queer faith leaders sometimes don't feel we're really being supported or heard by some who regard themselves as fully affirming allies. We've lost count of the number of high-level church discussions which have taken place and still do without the presence of those who bear the cost and are the main source of transforming the issues, including, I think, for transgender and non-binary people, the discussions that still take place in some places about marriage equality, which consist of discussions about binary same-sex as if we don't exist at all. Sometimes we're told by such allies themselves that at least it's better that at least they're there for us and they're our champions, in flagrant disregard of the well-established principles of nothing about us without us. Meanwhile, the toll on queer faith leaders, and thank you, Peter, for talking about resilience, but it's really, really tough. So many people are buried, they lose a high turnover, and the burnout is extraordinary. So again, let us give thanks to Pilgrim College, friends in the University of Divinity, and the Australian collaborators of feminist theologies for showing us another way.
So thirdly, after flourishing and lead, A is for awaken. When and how, beyond this coming week, will Christians together share the substantial body of queer faith? I think once more, this really goes to the heart of what we're seeking to begin, to take the first step in the coming days. But just to name some landmarks to give us a sense of of the history in which we place ourselves. It is over 50 years since Troy Perry founded the Metropolitan Community Church. Over 50 years, over 20 years since the first Anglican transgender priests in our own native England, and since the Centre for Lesbian and Gay Studies in Religion and Ministry was founded in the Pacific School of Religion. Almost 20 years since Jean Robinson was consecrated as our first out gay bishop in a committed sexual relationship, together with so many steps forward in scholarship and resources globally. And yet, in Australia, we typically live and converse as if queer faith was some kind of hypothetical question mark at best. I mean, if not an abomination, Joe and I kind of lose count of the number of times we get called an abomination. Is it a good week for abominations or not? So thereby, we're helping to perpetuate that horrendous false cultural binary of God versus the gays or the trans or the non-binary. Until now, until this wonderful moment, where have been our recognized university courses? Where are well-founded and funded agencies? Where are our leaders not just permitted in some spaces, but truly celebrated, supported, and promoted? For as always, the transformation of faith into something worth believing and living will not come primarily from the center, but from the margins, from those who bear the gifts and cost of transformation themselves.
So what is it that holds us back? Is it what Marcella Althaus-Reid called the exaggerated ethics of patience in our Christian cultures? When a fine queer ally, Paul Bayes, retired as Anglican Bishop of Liverpool earlier this year, he spoke of being an old man in a hurry. I've been radicalized by the oppression of LGBTI people, he said, not necessarily by the church, but by the world. I've had it with the church adding to the pain of this marginalized community by saying that we can't even discuss certain things. I know some are weary, and in the Uniting Church, for example, few, if any of us, want to repeat of painful controversies of the past in that sort of formal battle aspects. But I think Paul Bayes is right, isn't he, when he says questions need to be put sharply so that people can disagree well, rather than have another course on how we can agree better and bury the issues themselves. Paul's words help us anyway acknowledge that Penny and I are old women in a hurry. We just wish there were more of us. Across the Australian Christian communities, what seems to be poorly understood, at least in liberal, so-called inclusive quarters, is that we are living on rapidly evaporated, borrowed time. And if you didn't read the stats this morning from the census, they will back up what I'm saying. For queer people and most of wider Australia, 2017, I think, was a line in the sand. The Marriage Equality Postal Survey was such a horrendous, unnecessary strain on queer Australians, but the outcome was clear. All theology, in my opinion, is now theology after marriage equality, a key signifier of an established shift of values. And that explains the sheer energy of the subsequent right-wing religious freedom push, because they had to shore up what they'd got left because they knew they couldn't win any longer, they had been defeated. So the Christian right, in my opinion, grasps this fact of theology after marriage equality in a way that liberals and a lot of includers do not. There's no way back, only forward. But the Christian community, in some of its better guises, continues to act as if queer identity was still up for debate and disagreement, or is a matter of gentle tolerance without intentional policy.
We've got to R. R is for resource. So when will inclusive Christians put their money and their energies where they say their heart is? We could say a lot about that and how there's even resource for a course such as Queer Theology. Wonderful, a beginning. But we want to raise one thing: apologies. Queer people have gradually begun to hear churches formulate these. The Anglican Church in Southern Queensland at its synod last weekend decided they might have one of these. Yet we have a number of questions. Above all, we want to ask, so what power and money is being exchanged? Where, just on transgender issues, for example, do we see active and resourced formulation and sharing of gender expansive diverse liturgy, pastoral care guidelines, children and family resources, theological and ministry formation, education and awareness, and information and resourcing for campaigns of justice, or actually even just a properly marked toilet in a church space would be a start. There have been small steps forward recently, but these have been hard won and are still way behind what some other churches elsewhere in the world are showing is possible. The risk is that apologies are all too often simply more cheap grace. So once more, thank God this week for Pilgrim College, partners in feminist theology and the University of Divinity, and others who are opening a way for queer theology to flourish. But we might ask, what are the next steps in theology as part of vitally needed reparation?
Fifthly, finally, but through all we've shared, I hope, E for express. How will queer people of faith continue to claim our power? Because if we don't do that, those of us who are queer, don't blame anybody else. And how will others share in genuine, active partnerships? How do we move beyond the temptations to cheap grace? Jared Robinson Brown, in his recent book, Black, Gay, British, Christian, Queer, think about that for a moment, what he experienced, talks powerfully about what he calls the famine of grace. And he comes from a Wesleyan background, even though he's an Anglican at the moment, so he knows the strength of that tradition in terms of grace. This famine of grace experienced in the church by so many Black Christians and queer people. And he speaks about our faith struggles. Some of you may identify. I, perhaps like you, have been loved and hated by the church, healed and hurt by the church, encouraged and confused, enchanted and disillusioned. So it makes it a hard and a holy thing to tell the church how I really feel about it, in part because the experience and the memories are neither wholly bad nor wholly good. Now, just as the Black Lives Matter movement has called for the abolition of the police in its current form, Jared actually calls for the abolition of the church. And maybe in the Uniting Church, we might revisit whether or not it's a denomination we want, or whether or not we're calling some and the other churches into something bigger, a movement of transformation. For as he says, it is time the church made up its mind about how far the love of God can reach, because the ambivalence in our current life is costing precious lives, many of them Black and queer. So it's time for the church to be the church. The Queer Theology course this week is a step in the right direction, but it's still a small step. So when will we end the ambivalence?
The word express is also a call for more creative faith and theology, a renewal of the wider dimensions of the word queer. And that's part of our hope for the queer course. We see it not as a contribution to queer people of faith's advance as such, still less as a resource for apologetics. We are beyond apologetics, as Lynn Tonsted has said. Rather, it is an integral part of helping renew theology as a whole. Yeah, we seek to queer all theology, not to have queer theology over here as something separate. Mark Jordan, the Richard Reinhold Niebuhr Research Professor of Divinity at Harvard, puts it well. Speaking in conjunction with his Harvard Divinity School convocation address last year and his most recent book, Transforming Fire, he reflects on how we may enable theological education to be invigorating, inspiring, and adaptive, even as its traditional institutions shift and in some cases disappear. In relation to sex and gender, Jordan rightly affirms that languages built closely around those categories have important uses. They are also treasured by many, and we wouldn't want to take that away from them. Yet, as Jordan puts it, identity languages are risky, misleading, flattening. They leave out large parts of queer experience, including spirituality and ritual. And he therefore invites us to join him in revisiting other queer texts and ways of being, thereby reanimating and articulating new and alternative languages. And that also requires us to bring together the visible and the invisible, our institutions and academies with queer life and networks, creating new shelters for theology, not least contemplative. And above all, engaging those who are actually working it out, especially students and queer people in and beyond the churches. So as we might put it, if this forthcoming queer theology course is to be a positive expression, it also invites truly fresh expressions of other forms of faith, theology, and education.
I hope you'll permit me just a few more minutes, because I'm going to conclude with some final personal reflections. Today is the 35th anniversary of my ordination as a priest. And often I don't reflect upon it. For many, many years I didn't, but it's become, today is quite emotional for me in different ways, because thinking back, it was a day of what I would call ambiguous grace, with some joy, but also pain, because I was ordained and I stand there on the steps with Penny, who was pregnant, which is a lovely thing in an ordination, on the steps of London St. Paul's Cathedral by one of the most adamant Episcopal opponents of women's ordination, who soon after joined the Roman Church. And I like to think he's laughing up in heaven because, well, look what he ordained. After a long struggle, I went forward to ordination. I was very involved with the ordination of women and such like. And I was torn by the sense of feminist solidarity and the anguish of my wife and other women waiting for ordination. In the end, my deep sense of calling and the gain through it of one more yes vote in the House of Clergy held sway. But it was hard, however, surrounded as I was by male ordinands. However, so many of them were so obviously gay. And you don't have to have a very great gaydar in London to see that. Apart from the fact they were ostentatiously clad, most of them, in an extraordinary range of gorgeous robes that only the Anglo-Catholic tradition in the Church of England knows how to do. Because as one gay friend said to me so volubly, it's like my wedding day. Now that pain, joy, love of my priesting remains, I think, for many queer people like myself. Indeed, for the gay men with whom I was ordained, things can even be tougher now in many places. Church authorities, understandably, no longer turn a blind eye to queerness, pressured by understandable demands for accountability and transparency, as well as right-wing moral crusades and culture wars. We just cannot go back to don't ask, don't tell. So we, queer people, either come out and as the wider church, we also either come out together, if these stats today don't challenge us to do so, for a future really worth having, or we will simply die in the closet. So when I chose to take up the call to Pitt Street Uniting Church for a lot of different reasons, I did so partly in order to nurture queer faith liberation more fully, and to do so right now in a wholly unapologetic, beyond inclusive congregation. Because to honour the great pioneers like Dorothy McRae McMahon and Margaret Mayman, who's here tonight, on whose shoulders I now stand, we have to act likewise. We have to have a renewed ethics of divine impatience. We have to have fresh theological imagination, and we have to have new forms of intersectional solidarity. Recently, in reflecting on my ministry, I've been drawn to the metaphor of the limping priest. Stephen Burns isn't here tonight, but I'm sure I could chat with him about this because it has a long and varied use, including in uniting church circles. It helps express my experience before and after coming out as transgender. In the past, I limped as a priest because I couldn't fully acknowledge my God-given identity as transgender, as queer, as gloriously lovable, just as I am. Since transitioning, however, I have discovered I also limp, but differently. Previously, I carried my dysphoric body and an impaired soul and gospel. Today, however, I spend too much of my time carrying another larger body, the dysmorphic body of the church, a body which hardly recognizes its own dysmorphia and the damage it does to itself, its members, especially the weaker members, that 1 Corinthians 12 says you're supposed to hold in greatest honor, and so many others with whom it relates. So like other queer folk, sometimes I wonder, is it nearly time to lay down this burden? Because is there genuine breath and fight in the body still? Is there real possibility of vaccinating the virus of ecclesial queerphobia? Can we together transition into resurrection form? Will we have food as we have tonight, metaphorically as well as literally, or will we die from famine? The Queer Theology course for me is one step in celebrating the feast. But if we're truly to love one another as the beloved ducks we are, we better be clear where we want to be going. In the words of a great gay religious poet, it's gone. Oh, there it is. May we flare like the firefolk we are called to be, selving, acting in God's eye, what in God's eye we are, Christ. For Christ plays in 1,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not theirs. Thank you.